I stood before the door, my fingers trembling against the cold brass handle. The world outside was alive with Christmas cheer, but inside, only silence greeted me. My son, my only son, had locked me out. My heart broke as I realized the betrayal wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. What I found inside that house shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. It changed my life forever. My name is Sophia, and I'm 60 years old. They call me Nana, as every grandmother is in Italy, but that doesn't mean I'm just an old woman who sits on the sidelines. I've lived a life full of love, joy, and yes, hardship. I'm Italian, strong, passionate, and resilient. But nothing could have prepared me for what I would discover on that Christmas morning. I remember growing up in a small village, surrounded by the scents of homemade pasta, fresh-baked bread, and the sweet fragrance of ripe lemons. My family, my life, had always been deeply tied to Italy's traditions. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was all that mattered. I worked hard, learned to cook like my mother, and raised my son Marco with the same values of hard work, sacrifice, and love. Marco was my world. I gave him everything. My heart. My time. My life. I worked endless hours at the bakery, even when my back ached and my hands cracked from kneading dough. But I did it all for him. For his future. And when Marco met Alessandra, I welcomed her with open arms. I cooked for her, shared my recipes, and treated her as the daughter I never had. For years, I believed they were the family I had worked so hard for. But over time something shifted. They started pulling away from me, slowly, little by little. At first, it was easy to overlook. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they had their own lives to lead. But I couldn't ignore the growing distance forever. It was Christmas morning when everything came to a head. I had spent the night before preparing their favorite dishes, lasagna, my famous tiramisu, and a basket of fresh bread, hoping that maybe this year they would remember me. After all, Christmas was about family, wasn't it? As the sun rose, I wrapped the panettone I had baked just for them, tied with a red ribbon, and set out for their house. The streets of the village were quiet, with only the soft sound of church bells ringing in the distance. The air was crisp, the scent of wood smoke mixing with the freshness of pine. I had always loved Christmas in Italy, but today, something felt different. I could feel a knot tightening in my stomach, but I pushed it away. I told myself it was just nerves. When I arrived at their home, I knocked gently on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still, nothing. The silence was unsettling. I glanced at the window. There was no movement inside. I tried the door handle. It was locked. Marco. I called, my voice soft and unsure. Nothing. I waited a few more minutes, standing there in the cold, clutching the panettone in my hands. The minutes felt like hours. I tried the door once more, and this time, I heard a muffled voice from inside. "It's not a good time, Mama," Marco called out, his voice distant, almost strained. I stood frozen, the words cutting deeper than any sharp object ever could. "Not a good time? It's Christmas, Marco," I replied, my voice shaking. "I know, Mama, but we're having a small celebration today, just us," he said, his words vague, like he was avoiding my gaze, even though he couldn't see me. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. I had always been part of their Christmases. This year something was different and it hurt. It hurt more than I could put into words. "Marco, please," I said, trying to hide the sadness in my voice. "I'm your mother. I've always been here for you." There was a long pause. I could almost feel him wrestling with something inside, but then finally he spoke. "I'll call you later, okay? We'll celebrate another time." The door clicked shut. I stood there, holding the panettone, my hands trembling, a sense of betrayal flooding through me like a storm. Marco had locked me out of his life, just as he had locked me out of his home. I turned away, my legs feeling heavy, and walked back to my little cottage, each step feeling like it took me farther from the family I had once known. The air was cold, but it wasn't the winter chill that left me numb. It was the realization that my son, the one I had loved so dearly, had shut me out. He had chosen Alessandra's side, and with it, He had forgotten everything I had done for him, everything I had sacrificed. As I walked back, the words he had said echoed in my mind. "We'll celebrate another time." But I knew deep down that there would be no another time. That door was closed, and I wasn't sure I could ever open it again. I had given everything, and now I was left standing alone. The days that followed Christmas were filled with an unbearable heaviness, a weight that clung to me like the fog that often rolled in from the hills at dawn. I woke up each morning, and for a brief moment, I would forget the soft sunlight, the peacefulness of the Italian countryside. But then, as I slowly came to my senses, it all came rushing back. I had been excluded, forgotten, locked out of my own family. I tried to distract myself with the usual routine, tending to my garden, cleaning the small modest house I had lived in for nearly 40 years, cooking the meals that brought me comfort. I even visited the local market, where I always greeted the same vendors, who smiled and offered me the freshest tomatoes and herbs. But nothing could fill the emptiness that had lodged itself in my chest. Marco never called. He didn't come by to check on me. The days passed in a blur, and I began to realize that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This wasn't about Christmas. No, this was something deeper, something that had been festering for years. The more I thought about it, the more I recalled moments where Marco's behavior had seemed off, where his actions didn't match his words. Little signs, little lies. One evening, after I had prepared a meal for him and Alessandra, Marco had made an excuse to leave early, saying he had a meeting. But when I called his phone a few hours later, he didn't answer. He didn't even bother to text me back. This wasn't the son I had raised. This wasn't the Marco I had poured all my love into. I began to notice other strange things too. Every time I would visit their home, Alessandra would be distant. She would greet me with a smile, but her eyes always seemed to be looking elsewhere, as if she were avoiding my gaze. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. It felt as though they were pulling away from me, inch by inch, until I was no longer a part of their world. And then, one afternoon, I went to my son's house unannounced. I had no real reason for the visit, other than the aching need to feel close to him, to see if everything was as it had always been. But when I knocked, it was Alessandra who answered, not Marco. She looked different. Her smile was strained, and she seemed uncomfortable. "Mama," she said softly, as though she hadn't expected me. "Marco is out. He'll be back soon. Would you like to wait inside?" I didn't want to wait. I wanted answers. But I forced myself to smile and nodded. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of their home mixing with the scent of baking bread from the kitchen. I sat down on the couch, and we made small talk. But I couldn't help but feel the distance between us, the gap that had grown too wide to bridge. When Marco finally arrived, he didn't greet me with the warmth I had once known. Instead, he walked in quickly, his eyes scanning the room, avoiding me. He kissed Alessandra on the cheek, and the gesture seemed more like a duty than affection. My heart ached, but I said nothing. "Mama, I have to go out again soon," he said, his voice hurried. "I'm meeting some clients." I forced a smile, the pain in my chest becoming unbearable. "I understand. You're busy, Marco. But when will we spend time together, like we used to?" Marco hesitated. He opened his mouth, but then closed it, as if he couldn't find the right words. The silence between us grew, thick and uncomfortable. Alessandra shifted in her seat, glancing at Marco with a look I couldn't quite place, a look of complicity. It made my skin crawl. I don't know, Mama. We'll figure it out." His words were empty, hollow. I could see that he didn't mean them. I stood up, my hands trembling slightly. "I see," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Well, I suppose I'll go. I don't want to take up your time." As I walked out the door, the chill of the evening air felt like a slap to my face. I had always prided myself on being a strong woman, a woman who stood by her family no matter what. But now, I was starting to realize the truth. Marco and Alessandra had been manipulating me, keeping me at arm's length, shutting me out. I had given them everything, and yet, I was nothing more than an afterthought. That night, I sat alone in my small home, staring at the empty chair across from me where Marco had once sat, laughing and sharing stories of his childhood. The silence was deafening. It was in that silence that I heard the voice of doubt creeping in. What did I do wrong? Where did I go wrong? The questions spun in my mind, torturing me with every passing second. But then, a thought, one I hadn't considered before, began to take shape in my mind. I had given them everything, yes, but had I given too much? Had I allowed them to take so much from me that I had forgotten who I was, what I deserved? It was then that I realized I needed to stop asking myself what I had done wrong and start asking what I was willing to tolerate. I couldn't continue like this. I couldn't allow Marco and Alessandra to control my life, to make me feel small and insignificant. I had to protect myself. And if that meant facing the truth, no matter how painful, then so be it. That night, I called an old friend, Lena, a woman I had known since childhood. She was wise, sharp, and had a way of seeing things clearly when I couldn't. When I explained everything that had been happening, she didn't offer empty sympathy. Instead, she told me something I will never forget. Sophia, she said, her voice firm but kind, you've spent too long putting others before yourself. It's time to take back your life. You deserve respect. You deserve peace. And if your family can't give you that, then you need to protect yourself. Don't let them take what's yours. Those words were a lifeline. They gave me the courage to make a decision I had been too afraid to make for far too long. The next day, I consulted a lawyer. It was time to take action. The decision to consult a lawyer was the hardest thing I had ever done. In my heart, I knew it was the right thing, but my mind wrestled with guilt. Was I betraying my son? Had I become the villain in this story? I had spent so many years being the peacemaker, the mother who always put family first, who always sacrificed her own happiness for the sake of others. But now I had to ask myself, was my happiness not worth protecting? I remember sitting in the small office, the smell of fresh ink and paper filling the air. The lawyer, a man named Roberto, looked at me with kind eyes. His hands folded on the desk as he listened to my story. When I finished explaining everything, the betrayal, the silence, the exclusion, he sat back, his fingers tapping the edge of the desk thoughtfully. Sophia, he said, his voice calm but firm, you've been manipulated. It's clear they've been taking advantage of your love for them, and now it's time for you to take back control. You've sacrificed so much, and yet, they've pushed you aside. You have every right to protect yourself, to make sure your voice is heard. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was mixed with a sense of fear. What would happen now? Could I really go through with it? Could I really stand up to my son and his wife? But Roberto's words echoed in my mind, and I realized something important. I had been living in fear for too long. Fear of losing them. Fear of being alone. Fear of confronting the truth. But now, I wasn't afraid of the truth anymore. The truth was that I had given all of myself, and I deserved respect. I deserved to be treated with love and dignity, just like anyone else. Over the next few weeks I took action. Roberto helped me understand the legal steps I needed to take to protect my assets, to ensure that my property and finances were safe. I hired an investigator to look into the suspicious activities I had been noticing. Small things at first, but things that now seemed too significant to ignore. There were discrepancies in the family finances, misused funds, and decisions made without my consent, decisions that affected me directly. I hadn't wanted to believe it, but the evidence was clear. Marco and Alessandra had been taking advantage of me, manipulating me for their own gain. Each day, I felt a little stronger. I still had moments of doubt, moments when I questioned if I was doing the right thing. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. A woman who had taken control of her life again. The woman I had once been, full of fire and strength, was starting to return. It wasn't easy. I had to face my son, the person I had loved more than anything. And when I finally confronted him, the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. It was a Thursday afternoon when Marco came to visit. He didn't know that I had already gathered the evidence. He didn't know that I was prepared to stand up for myself, no longer the passive mother who would accept whatever was given to her. He knocked on the door, and I opened it, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ciao, Mama," he said, his smile tight, as though he were unsure how to approach me. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, years of tension that had been building, and now, finally, it was time to speak the truth. "Marco," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "We need to talk." He frowned, stepping inside, and I closed the door behind him. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we had shared countless meals, countless laughs. But now, the silence between us was suffocating. "I don't know where to begin," I said, staring at my hands. "You've been shutting me out for months now. I don't understand why. You've ignored me, excluded me from family events, and lied to me. I've given you everything, Marco. And now, I find out that you've been mismanaging the money I trusted you with. You and Alessandra have been taking advantage of my trust. And I won't stand for it any longer." His face turned pale, his eyes darting to the side, avoiding mine. "What are you talking about, Mama?" he asked, his voice rising in defense. "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice firm. "I know about the money, the things you've been hiding. I know about the investments you made without consulting me, the decisions you made behind my back. I trusted you, Marco. And you betrayed that trust." The silence that followed was deafening. Marco's face shifted from confusion to guilt, and I could see the shame in his eyes, though he tried to hide it. Mama, I didn't want to upset you," he stammered. "I was trying to protect you." "Protect me," I repeated, my voice shaking with emotion. "You were protecting yourself. You were using me to secure your own future while ignoring me, leaving me in the dark. And Alessandra. She's been part of this too, hasn't she?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was written all over his face. "Enough," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I don't want your excuses anymore, Marco. I want respect. I want honesty. And if I can't get that from my own son, then I will take the necessary steps to protect myself." He looked at me, his eyes wide with shock, but there was no turning back now. I had taken control. The lawyer was on standby. The investigator had the evidence. I was ready to take whatever steps necessary to secure my future. The days that followed Marco's visit were filled with an unsettling quiet. I had spoken my truth, laid bare the hurt I had been carrying for far too long, but I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I had expected a fight, perhaps. A pleading for forgiveness, or maybe an angry outburst. But Marco was silent, his shame hanging thick between us like a heavy fog. I had spoken my piece, but now the real test was ahead of me. Would I be able to follow through with what I had started? Would I have the strength to continue standing my ground, even when it felt like I was losing everything I had worked for? The first thing I did after that confrontation was call Roberto, the lawyer. He was kind but firm, just the kind of person I needed by my side. I had made the decision to take action, and now I had to follow through. With Roberto's help, I began the process of securing my financial rights, making sure that no one could take advantage of me again. It wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming my dignity. My son, Marco, had used my love and trust as a weapon against me. It was time to take back control, and I wasn't going to let anyone stand in my way. But as I sat at my kitchen table, going over the papers and planning my next steps, the guilt still gnawed at me. Was I being too harsh? Was I throwing away everything for the sake of pride? I shook the thoughts away. This wasn't pride. This was self-preservation. The love I had given Marco, the sacrifices I had made, had been enough. I had given him a lifetime of devotion. But now I needed to give myself something. My own respect. I had learned the hard way that respect wasn't something anyone could give you. It was something you had to demand for yourself. That evening, I sat down and wrote Marco a letter. It wasn't a letter of anger or vengeance. It wasn't filled with accusations. No. I simply wrote him the truth that had been building up for months, maybe even years. I wrote about my feelings of betrayal, my hurt, and my disappointment. But most importantly, I wrote about my decision to take control of my life. I wrote about the steps I was taking to protect myself, both financially and emotionally. And I told him that, for the first time in years, I was going to put myself first. As I sealed the envelope, a sense of peace washed over me. This wasn't the end of my relationship with Marco. I wasn't giving up on him. But I was giving up on the idea that I had to tolerate disrespect in the name of family. I was giving up on the idea that love meant being a doormat. The next day, I sent the letter. I didn't hear from him immediately, but I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't waiting for things to go back to how they were. I was no longer chasing after something that was broken beyond repair. Weeks passed, and I continued to take control of my life. I invested time in myself, learning new skills, spending more time with my friends, and taking long walks through the hills near my home. The days grew longer as spring began to emerge from the cold grip of winter, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the warmth of the sun on my face, not just physically, but emotionally as well. And then one day, Marco came to my door. His face was pale, his eyes red from crying. I didn't open the door immediately. I stood inside, my heart beating quickly in my chest, unsure of what to expect. But after a long moment, I took a deep breath and opened it. "Ciao, Mama," Marco said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've come to talk." I stepped aside, letting him in. He looked different. Smaller somehow, as if the weight of everything that had happened had taken a toll on him. We sat at the same table where we had had so many conversations over the years, and this time, the silence between us was different. It wasn't filled with tension, but with understanding. "I read your letter," Marco said, his voice low. "And I've been thinking a lot, Mama." I waited, giving him the space to say what he needed to say. "I'm sorry," he continued, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry for what I did to you. For everything. I was selfish. I thought I was doing what was best for me, but I see now how much I've hurt you. I never meant to. You've always been there for me, and I've taken that for granted." I watched him as he spoke, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope. I wasn't sure where this would go, or if anything would change, but in that moment, I realized something important. I had taken control of my own life, and no matter what happened next, I had found peace in that. "I've made mistakes too," I said softly, my voice calm but resolute. "But the most important thing I've learned is that I have to protect myself. I have to love myself the way I've loved you. And if that means stepping back, so be it." Marco nodded, his eyes wet with tears. "I understand, Mama. I really do. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to try to make things right." We sat in silence for a while, each of us processing the weight of what had been said. I didn't know if things would ever go back to how they were, and I wasn't sure I wanted them to. What mattered was that I had finally stopped tolerating mistreatment, and I had chosen my own peace over the chaos they had brought into my life. And in that moment I knew. I had regained my strength, my independence, and my dignity. No one could take that from me. Not even my own son. The weeks after Marco's visit were a time of reflection, not just for me but for him as well. There was a quiet tension in the air, an understanding that things between us had changed forever. But instead of the chaos I once feared, I found a new sense of calm. I had made the difficult decision to prioritize my well-being, and I could finally feel the weight of those years of sacrifice lifting off my shoulders. I began to take more time for myself, something I had never done before. For years, my life had been all about giving, serving, caring for others. Whether it was Marco, Alessandra, or even my neighbors. I had poured my love into everything around me, often forgetting to save a little for myself. But now, I realized how important it was to reclaim those pieces of myself that I had lost along the way. I spent my afternoons walking along the familiar cobbled streets of the village, breathing in the scent of the earth, and letting the warm sun kiss my face. I visited old friends, those who had been with me through thick and thin, and we sat over cups of espresso, laughing and reminiscing about the past. The conversations were light-hearted, filled with the kind of joy that only time can bring. A joy rooted in wisdom, in the understanding that life is too short to spend worrying about things beyond our control. But even in these peaceful moments, the shadows of betrayal still lingered. The truth was that while I had forgiven Marco, I hadn't forgotten. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired, And though I wanted to believe in a future where things could go back to how they were, I knew that deep down, it was never going to be the same again. As the days passed, Marco reached out more frequently. He called to check on me, and though his words were sincere, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to make up for lost time, for the hurt he had caused. I accepted his calls, but I kept my distance. He still hadn't fully understood the damage he had done, not just to me, but to our family. I couldn't let him back in too quickly. The process of healing, of rebuilding trust, had to be on my terms, not his. One day, I received a letter from Alessandra. It wasn't the kind of letter I expected. There were no apologies, no signs of remorse. Instead, it was a letter filled with explanations, justifications for everything that had happened, as though she were trying to rationalize the actions that had hurt me so deeply. I read it through twice, each word cutting deeper than the last. She wrote about how hard things had been for her and Marco, how they had been under stress, and how they had tried to protect me in their own way. But the more I read, the clearer it became, they still didn't get it. I didn't respond to her letter immediately. I didn't know if I even wanted to. But it made me realize something crucial. I didn't owe anyone an explanation anymore. Not Alessandra. Not Marco. I had spent so much time trying to make others understand my feelings, trying to explain myself, that I had lost sight of my own needs. The truth was, I didn't need their validation. I didn't need their forgiveness. What I needed was my own peace, my own sense of self. I decided to take another step toward my own independence. I began to make changes around my home, rearranging the furniture, creating new spaces for myself where I could focus on the things I loved. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done since I was a young woman. The soft strokes of the brush on the canvas brought me a sense of calm I hadn't known in years. Each painting was a reflection of my journey, my pain, my healing, and the empowerment that came from taking control of my life. One afternoon, as I sat in my garden, painting the view of the hills that had always been so familiar to me, I felt a strange peace wash over me. It was as if the past few months had been a long, arduous journey, but I had finally reached the summit. I was no longer the woman who had been locked out on Christmas morning, the woman who had been betrayed by her own flesh and blood. I had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more in tune with who I was than ever before. It wasn't easy to let go of the dream of the family I had once imagined. It wasn't easy to accept that things between me and Marco might never be the same. But I had learned that the strength I needed wasn't in holding on to the past. It was in letting go of what I couldn't control and embracing what I could. I couldn't change Marco or Alessandra. But I could change myself. And that was enough. One evening, after a long day of painting, I stood on my balcony, looking out over the village. The sky was painted with hues of pink and orange, and the sound of church bells echoed softly in the distance. I took a deep breath and smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because I had found peace in the midst of chaos. I had let go of the pain. I had forgiven, not for their sake, but for my own. And in that moment, I realized that I had finally regained control of my life. As the days turned into weeks, I felt the weight of the past slowly lift from my shoulders. My home, once filled with the shadows of betrayal, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe deeply without fear of what might be lurking around every corner. The garden I had spent years cultivating seemed to mirror the growth I was experiencing within myself. Each flower that bloomed, each vine that twisted and grew, was a testament to my resilience, my ability to bloom despite the harshest of seasons. It wasn't just the physical space around me that had changed, it was me, deep down in my soul. I had spent so many years caring for others, making sure they had everything they needed, that I had forgotten what it meant to care for myself. I had poured my love into my family, into Marco, into Alessandra, without ever stopping to ask if I was being treated with the same care and respect. But now, I had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that my worth was not determined by what I could give to others. My worth was inherent, rooted in who I was, not what I did. Marco's calls became more frequent, but I was careful not to let him back into my life too quickly. There were still things I needed to process, things I needed to understand about the choices he had made. He had apologized, yes, but apologies alone didn't heal wounds. Time and actions did. I told myself I wasn't ready to forgive him completely. Not yet. I needed space. I needed him to prove, through more than just words, that he understood the depth of the pain he had caused. But even as I held on to that boundary, I could feel my heart slowly softening. After all, he was my son. I had loved him for so long, raised him through the trials of life. Could I really close that door forever? Alessandra, on the other hand, had stopped reaching out. The letter she had sent me still sat on the corner of my desk, untouched. I had read it, but there was nothing in it that felt sincere. She had apologized for the wrong things, apologizing for the stress, for the difficulty of their lives, but she hadn't truly acknowledged the harm she had done to me. She hadn't looked beyond her own perspective to understand the damage their actions had caused. I wasn't sure what her intentions were anymore, or if there was even room in my life for someone who saw me only as a convenience, a person to be managed and controlled. One evening, I decided to take a walk by the lake near my home. The sky was painted with the colors of sunset, and the air was still, carrying with it the smell of fresh pine and damp earth. The lake's surface was smooth as glass, reflecting the trees and mountains like a perfect mirror. I sat on a bench, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, but also the quiet peace that had come with it. In that moment, I realized that I wasn't just healing from the betrayal. I was learning to embrace the strength that came with it. The power to stand alone. The power to choose my peace over chaos. The power to reclaim my life, my choices, and my happiness. It was in this peaceful solitude that I began to understand that my life wasn't defined by the people around me, by the family I had given everything to. My life was mine to live. And while I would always love Marco, no mother can ever fully stop loving her child, I had learned that love had its limits. It could no longer be the kind of love that sacrificed my own needs for the sake of others. It had to be a love that respected my boundaries, that honored my value, and that allowed me to be whole on my own. A few days later, Marco called again. This time, I felt a sense of calm wash over me, a confidence I hadn't had before. His voice was softer this time, less guarded, as though he understood the weight of what had happened between us. "Mama, I've been thinking about what you said," he started, his voice hesitant. "I know I've hurt you, and I'm truly sorry for that. I want to make things right." I could hear the sincerity in his voice, and for the first time, I felt like he understood. But I didn't rush into forgiveness. Instead, I took a deep breath and replied calmly, "Marco, I appreciate your apology. But I need time. I need you to show me, through your actions, that you understand what you've done." There was a pause on the other end of the line. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me to let him back in. Instead, he simply said, "I understand. And I'll do whatever it takes." For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. But I wasn't ready to rush back into the same dynamic. I needed to see that he was committed to making real changes, not just for me but for himself. As the weeks passed, Marco continued to reach out, but I remained cautious. I kept the boundaries I had set, making sure not to let myself fall back into the role of the caretaker. I had learned that love doesn't mean sacrificing your own peace, your own needs, and your own self-respect. One evening, after a particularly long walk, I sat down on my balcony, a glass of wine in hand. The sky was dark now, but the stars shone brightly, and the cool breeze rustled the leaves of the olive trees below. I looked out over the village I had called home for so many years, and I realized something profound. I had lived my life for others. I had given everything, loved deeply, and sacrificed immensely. But now, I was finally learning to live for myself. To take back my power. To stop waiting for others to change in order for me to be happy. My happiness, my peace, was no longer dependent on them. As I sat there, feeling the cool breeze and listening to the soft hum of the village, I knew that no matter what happened with Marco, no matter the outcome, I had already won. I had found myself again. I had reclaimed my strength. And that was enough. The days after that evening on my balcony felt different. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but a subtle change, like the gentle flow of a river smoothing jagged rocks over time. I had accepted that the past was behind me, and what mattered now was how I moved forward. The pain, the betrayal, the years of sacrificing myself for the sake of others, it was all in the past. I could feel a deep sense of peace settling over me, something I had never truly felt before. It wasn't that the past didn't matter, it had shaped me after all, but I realized that I no longer had to live in its shadow. I had grown. I had learned. I had found strength in the places I had once thought were fragile. I continued with my daily routines, but now they felt different. I no longer worked tirelessly to fill the void left by others. I painted, I walked, I spent time with the people who truly cared for me, those who had never turned their backs. Life, in all its simplicity, had a beauty I hadn't recognized before. The world was full of small joys, moments of peace that I could hold on to without the weight of guilt or regret. But even as I enjoyed this newfound peace, Marco's calls continued. Each time, he seemed more sincere, more focused on repairing what he had broken. Yet, I still kept my distance. I wasn't in a hurry to jump back into the role I had once played. Always the one to forgive, always the one to overlook. This time I had to be sure. One afternoon, after a long walk through the hills, I returned home to find a letter from Marco. It was different from the previous ones. It wasn't filled with excuses or justifications. It was simply an apology, plain and honest. And at the end, he wrote something that stopped me in my tracks. "Mama, I can't change the past, but I promise you, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I can be the son you deserve. I'm not asking you to forgive me all at once, but I hope one day, we can rebuild what was lost." His words hit me harder than I expected. A mix of emotions flooded my chest. Hurt, relief, love, but most of all, a profound understanding that things were finally changing. This wasn't the Marco of the past. This was a man who, despite everything, was willing to fight for our relationship. And while I knew that forgiveness couldn't be rushed, I also knew that I wasn't closed off to the idea of rebuilding. But I would do so on my terms, at my pace. It was then that I made the decision. I would see him, not with the expectation that everything would be fixed overnight, but with the hope that together we could begin to heal. I called him and told him to meet me at the cafe in the village, the one we had visited together when he was young, a place filled with memories of better times. When he arrived, I could see the weight of the years pressing on his face. He wasn't the same young man who had hurt me so deeply. He was older, wiser, and perhaps, finally, ready to understand what he had done. We sat across from each other, not speaking at first. There was no need for words, just a quiet understanding that we were here to take the first step, and that was enough for now. "I'm sorry, Mama," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I can't take back the pain I caused you, but I promise, I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." I looked at him, really looked at him. This wasn't the Marco I had known in my pain. This was a man who was beginning to see the truth of his actions, a man who understood the value of love, trust, and respect. I reached across the table and placed my hand on his, a gesture of solidarity, of understanding. "You have a long way to go, Marco," I said softly. "But I see you trying. And that means something." We sat there in silence for a long time, not needing to say anything more. The air between us had shifted, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be perfect. But I could see the potential for something new. Something stronger. And that was enough. As we left the cafe, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I had opened the door to forgiveness, but not the kind that erased the past. This was a forgiveness rooted in truth, in understanding, and in the willingness to rebuild with care. Marco wasn't the same person he once was. And neither was I. We had both changed, and while the past couldn't be undone, we had the opportunity to shape the future. I returned home that evening, the sun setting behind the hills, casting long shadows over the village. I stood at my balcony, looking out at the familiar sights of my home, and I realized something profound. I had lived through pain, but I had also lived through healing. I had found my strength in the darkest of times, and I had finally learned that my happiness wasn't dependent on anyone else. I was the one who held the power to shape my life. And that realization, perhaps the greatest gift of all, was mine to keep. In the end, it wasn't about Marco's mistakes or Alessandra's coldness. It wasn't about the family I had lost. It was about the woman I had become, the woman who had stood up for herself, who had fought for her peace, and who had learned that her worth was not determined by the actions of others, but by her own choices. And so, as I stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt the warmth of the future in my heart. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing for sure. I was ready for whatever it was. I had taken back my life. And nothing could take that away. As time passed, I began to settle into this new chapter of my life. The pain of betrayal, though still present in moments of quiet reflection, no longer defined me. I had reclaimed my strength, my dignity, and most importantly, my peace. The days no longer felt heavy with the weight of lost trust. Instead, they felt light with the promise of new beginnings. Beginnings I would shape on my own terms. Marco, slowly but surely, began to prove that his apology wasn't just words. He made an effort to show up in ways he never had before, whether it was through small acts of kindness or simply taking the time to check in on me without any ulterior motives. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping promises to erase the past. But the change in him was palpable. It was in the way he spoke to me now, the sincerity in his eyes, the way he valued my opinions. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. I continued to live my life with intention, filling it with the things that brought me joy: painting, walking by the lake, meeting with friends, and most importantly, taking care of myself. I no longer sought approval from anyone. I didn't need to. I had learned to find approval from within. Alessandra, on the other hand, remained distant. Her letters had stopped coming, and though I didn't chase after her approval, I felt a quiet sadness about the way things had unfolded between us. I had once opened my heart to her, treated her like a daughter, but she had never truly reciprocated that love. She had been a part of the pain, but she also wasn't the cause of it. Marco's actions had been his alone. So, I didn't waste my energy on the what-ifs regarding Alessandra. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. I didn't need her validation to feel complete. One day, Marco asked me if I would join him and his family for dinner. I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to ensure I was ready. I didn't want to rush back into anything, but I also didn't want to close the door completely. I agreed, but this time it was on my terms. I would not be the passive mother who simply accepted whatever crumbs were thrown her way. I would be there, but I would stand tall in my truth. The night of the dinner arrived, and I dressed with care, simple but elegant. I had spent so many years living for others, wearing the apron of a mother, a caregiver, always thinking of what they needed. But now, I dressed for myself, with a quiet confidence in my step. When I arrived at their home, Marco greeted me at the door with a warmth that felt genuine, his face lighting up as he saw me. There was no rush, no apology hanging in the air. Just a simple, quiet understanding. Dinner was filled with laughter, but it wasn't the forced kind that had suffocated our family in the past. It was natural, easy, and real. We spoke of small things, memories, simple joys, and it was in those moments that I realized something important. The family I had once dreamed of wasn't gone. It had changed, but it was still there, in the form of new beginnings. As I sat there at the table, looking around at Marco and his family, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I had spent so much time trying to hold on to a version of my family that no longer existed, and in the process, I had lost myself. But now I could see clearly. I had found the strength to move forward, and in doing so, I had given myself the greatest gift of all: freedom. Freedom from guilt. Freedom from the past. Freedom to live my life with love and respect for myself, and for those who truly respected me in return. The night ended quietly. Marco walked me to my door, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. We didn't need to say anything more. We had taken the first step together, and that was enough. As I closed the door behind me, I stood in the quiet of my home, my heart full. The shadows of the past had faded, replaced by the soft glow of a new beginning. The family I had once longed for wasn't lost to me forever. But more importantly, I had discovered that the love and respect I had been seeking from them, I could find in myself. I had walked through the storm of betrayal, and now, I stood in the light of my own strength. And that was enough.